everyone. We probably made it to a Friday. I'm going to Friday.
Only have, there's nothing in time now, just 11:30.
So I guess after today, we have just 2 more weeks or six more classes of this. So, okay, so I'm going to start by returning your graded homework that I got. Then we'll take a look at the handout that you have from me today.
What they say?
Did glasses protect a lot of stuff in there?
Not really.
No. I mean, yeah, like kind of forward.
Directly there.
Yeah, not side and stuff.
It's also like aerodynamics, you get like the spread here, then you come right back, and it's there.
Nice.
So something like, it is a light thing, and you're going face like zippo, it'll boom right into there.
Face.
This is from before.
Oh man, I didn't put a third in that chord. Oh, that chord, what am I doing? I'm writing like, on every side.
All right, so for today you had part writing homework handout number letter C, and hopefully you'll recall from last class we talked about how to part write 2 reposition chords whose roots are a second or a seventh apart. There was one main guideline, and that was if the bass moves up, move all 3 upper voices down in contrary motion to the bass. And if the bass moves down, then you move all 3 voices up. So it's always in contrary motion or the opposite motion that the bass is moving. Okay? Then there was the one main big exception. Who remembers the 2 Roman numerals that create what's called a deceptive progression?
5 to 6.
Yeah, 5 to 6. When you have those 2 chords right next to each other, 5 going to 6, you have to make an exception to the guideline, and you also have to especially make an exception to the normal doubling rule that we've been using. Okay. When a 5 chord goes to a 6 chord, 2 of the voices will be going up, and 2 of the voices will be going down. And that will lead to a doubled, what is the chord number that's doubled in that 6 chord? The third of the 6 chord is doubled, right? So we do not double the root only in a 6 chord when it comes after a 5. We double the third of the chord instead, and that helps us to avoid parallel fifths, parallel octaves, unresolved leading tones in our voices. It helps us avoid melodic augmented seconds, all these nasty things that show up on our yellow rule sheet. Okay, so let's see. Did you find on your handout that's due today, did you find a 5 going to a 6?
Yeah.
Good, I hope you did. And I am planning to collect this handout, by the way, but before I do that, does anyone have any questions about anything that they'd like to see before I pick this up? Either the analysis at the bottom or any of the errors in the part writing on the top of the paper. Yes?
With the Roman numerals, not the first one of the last 4.
The first,
So
maybe it'd be quicker if you just point it out.
okay, down here. The first one.
Well, that one there, okay. Do you have 2 blanks or 1?
I have,
Yeah, 2 blanks,
Yeah.
okay, right there. Okay. All right, good, yeah, so let's take a look at that. I'll try the black marker, although it's starting to fade on me last class. But the first one of the last 4 has an A in the bass, and I'm not going to be so picky about the rhythm right now, I just want to get the notes up. And then a C, and then it had an F. And we are in the key of C, so we have to give this a Roman numeral. It does look like we have 3 different pitches here, A, C, and F. And if I rearrange those to put them in root position or stacked thirds, the F would need to be on the bottom. So this is actually one of our familiar F, A, C chords. It's a triad, it's 3 different pitches. And remember, when we analyze chords with Roman numerals, the Roman number itself that we choose to use is going to be the same number as the root is of a, how do I say this? The root is what scale degree in the key of C? Yeah, F is scale degree 4, right? So I'm going to use a Roman numeral 4 for this chord. Now, do you remember from last unit in major keys, is the Roman numeral 4 always capital or lowercase? It's capital, that's right. Yeah, so I'm going to put a 4 in here because it's a major triad and it's built on the fourth. The root is the fourth scale degree of this key. But I'm not quite finished yet because the triad is actually not in root position on the staff here. It turns out that the third of the chord, the A, is the one that's the lowest sounding pitch of all. And when the third of the chord is on the bottom, we say that the triad is in first inversion, remember? Does anyone remember what number we used to indicate?
6.
It's the 6, that's right. So I would finish off my answer for that chord with a capital Roman numeral 4, 6. And that's what I would, how I would analyze that chord. Good, other questions?
The one after that.
Okay, the one right after that. I guess that's easy enough to figure out. So we got, the one right after it is an F in the bass. Then we have an A in the middle voice. And we have a D in the top voice. So, again, a 3-note chord, so that makes it a triad. In my mind, if I rearrange it so that it's in root position, the D needs to be on the bottom. That would tell me that D is the root, that F is the third, and that A is the fifth of the triad. Okay, in C major, what scale degree is the root D? Second scale degree, right? Scale degree 2. Okay. And you can either look at the quality of this triad and see that it's minor, or you can remember last unit that we learned that 2 Roman numeral 2s in major keys should be lowercase or minor. So I got to put a minor 2 there. But again, I'm not quite finished because the chord isn't in root position. Once again, it looks like the third of the chord is on the bottom. So I'm going to need another 6 to go along with this 2 to show that it's a 2-chord in first inversion. And that's how I would analyze that one. Good. All right. What time we got here? I got time for one more question if someone has a question. If you don't, that's fine too. Okay, then how about this? Make sure your name is on it as usual, and I'll come around and pick it up. Get it back to you hopefully on Monday. Are you ready? Yes. All right, yeah, thank you. Oh, thank you. You got 2 again. Oh. Okay. Thank you. All right, so for those of you that were here a little bit before class, I did mention to you that we have finished now learning how to part write all types of root position triads. Root position triads where the roots are in any kind of intervallic relationship. Either they're a perfect fourth or perfect fifth apart, third or sixth apart, or whether they are second or seventh apart. That covers all of them. So we are basically done with learning how to part write root position triads. But I thought I'd take this opportunity to use part of this class to teach you how to part write one triad that's inverted. And believe it or not, I'm going to skip first inversion triads because those are a little trickier. We'll get to those next week. But I would like to tell you how to part write a triad in second inversion. And what are the base position numbers or inversion numbers for a second inversion triad? That's right, 6, 4, remember? Yeah, that last unit, that was a humdinger, right? Those are the good old days. boy, this is a basis that's almost becoming worthless. I might have to go to the red. 6-4 indicates a triad in second inversion. And remember, when a triad is in second inversion, the fifth of the chord is the one that's on the bottom. So if I just, on the top staff here, the treble staff, if I just write a C major triad, if I write it in root position, for instance, that we know is C-G, and so if I put a C major triad in second inversion, or 6-4 inversion, that means the G is going to be on the bottom. And there we have a C major triad in second inversion. Now, if I were to label or analyze this triad in the key of C using Roman numerals, I would use a capital 1 because it's a C major chord built on the first scale degree. And then I would, of course, add the 6-4 to show that this triad is in second inversion. And it turns out that of all the Roman numerals on all the scale degrees we have, the only triad in second inversion we are going to learn and discuss for the rest of this semester and for a good portion of probably next semester too. We're just going to deal with the second inversion triad on scale degree 1, otherwise known as the 1-6-4 chord. We're not going to be dealing with 2 6-4s or 3 6-4s or 4 6-4. We're not going to be dealing with any of those for a long time. In fact, some of those we won't even deal with at all, probably. Yeah, those other chords, just in this style, again, they're not used in second inversion. I could mention that second inversion is the weakest, the most unstable inversion or base position of a triad of a chord.
So wouldn't it make sense to have something like 5 so you have even more of a push? Or would that,
Say that one more time.
wouldn't it make more sense to use that on 5 then? Because then you have even more of a push. If it feels unstable as an unstable chord.
Well, I don't know if this is where you're going, but we're only going to deal with the tonic 6-4 chord, and we're going to find out that the only chord that goes to is a root position 5. I don't know if that's what you were getting at when you
It's
mentioned the 5.
more so, why don't we use second inversion on a 5 chord? Because the 5 chord's already
Oh, I see what you're
pushing, it's
saying.
already dominant. That you
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying. You will find out next semester that sometimes a second inversion chord, or a second inversion 5 chord is used, but it's not even called a 5 chord in second inversion. It's called something different because its function is completely different. But that'll be next semester. All right, so for our purposes, I just want you to know you don't need to write any Roman numeral with 6-4 except for 1. That's the only chord we're dealing with in second inversion. And just so you know, although I'm not going to use an example here, but in minor keys, it would obviously be written as this, right? Lowercase Roman numeral 1 under 6-4. Yeah. Okay. All right, so the only chord a 1-6-4 goes to is a root position 5, and we're going to learn how to part write the notes of this chord correctly to get to the notes and spell that chord. Now, before I do it in 4 voices, in the key of C, since this is the key I'm using, how do you spell a root position 5 chord from the bottom up? What's the root of a 5 chord in C major, for instance? G, right? It's going to be one of these GBD chords. Now, one thing I want you to observe and notice about this before I put it in 4 voices is, you see how the second inversion triad on scale degree 1 has the same lowest note as the lowest note of the 5 chord. You see how these are identical? That's always going to be true. That's a fact. That the bass note, or the lowest note of a 1-6-4 chord, is always going to be the same note as the bass note of a root position 5. That's always true in any key. Okay. And we're going to use that a common tone, we're going to use that as an advantage, so to speak, when we actually part write this chord to this chord in 4 voices. In 4 voices. So let me, maybe at the beginning of the staff there, let me go ahead and write up a 1-6-4 going to 5 in the key of C major, and I'll show you how it's done in 4 full voices. First of all, I'm going to take the G in the bass, and I'm going to put it, basses like we like to sing when young here, if we can. That's right. Okay, so there's the same bass note in both chords. One thing you do need to know that, and this is actually the last rule on your yellow sheet. Finally we get to the last one, number 15. And that is, I know we're supposed to double the root or the bass note of a root position triad, but what are we supposed to double in a triad with a triad in second inversion? Well, that's what rule 15 says. It says double the bass note of a triad in second inversion. Now, with a root position triad, doubling the bass note means you're doubling the root, because the root is in the bass. But with a second inversion triad, saying that you double the bass note means that you're doubling the fifth of the chord, right? Because remember, the fifth of the chord is the lowest sounding tone of all. So however you'd like to remember it, I kind of, instead of remembering, double the fifth of this, of a second inversion triad, double the root of it, I like to remember double the bass of a second inversion triad. And I like to remember double the bass of a root position triad. So right now, that's the only doubling rule we have for every chord. Just double whatever note is in the bass. That's pretty easy to remember, right? Okay? So I'm going to double the bass in this 1-6-4 chord. I'm going to put another G, and I'm just going to happen to put it in the tenor. I could put it in the alto, or I could put the G in the soprano. It doesn't matter. Then to fill out this chord, I need a C and an E. So let's say I'll put the E here, and I'll put the C here for good spacing. And there I have a correctly voiced, a correctly spelled second inversion triad on scale degree 1 in our four-voice chorale style texture. We always know we need to double one of the pitches of a triad, and when the triad is in second inversion, you double whatever pitch is in the bottom, is in the bass. But notice that the doubling rule for this is the same as the doubling rule for this. So that also means then that if the bass notes are the same with both of these chords, as they always will be, that means the doubled notes in both of these chords will all be the same as well. Right? So this chord needs 2 Gs. This chord also needs 2 Gs. And again, as I said before, we're going to use these shared common tones to our advantage here, and that is we're not going to move either of them. The doubled notes, which are the same in both chords, will remain static and should remain static. They don't move up, they don't move down, they just slide over on the same pitch. And I think that makes it kind of easy, because whatever note is in the bass here will be doubled, and that will be also true of this chord too. So you just find those two notes, whatever voices they're in the bass and one of the upper ones, and just slide over. Then the final step to part writing these is the remaining 2 voices, they move down by step. That's it. Because check out what happens when I move this C down by step. It comes to a B, which is in this chord. And when I move the E down by step, it comes to a D, which is also in this chord. Right? It's a DVD chord. And I have all the right notes, and I have the right doubling in the 5 chord.
So would that make it feel like the 5 is more home?
Yes. What it does is, it's got a kind of a weak or an unstable chord that moves to something that's much stronger and more stable. Because root position is always more stable than an inverted chord. It's designed that way, and the further you go into theory, the more you'll become familiar with this. This is called the tonic 6/4, the 1/6/4. And some musicians they'll think that maybe these 2 notes, they kind of treat them just as kind of a temporary embellishments or ornaments that eventually fall to the real true chord tone of something that's more stable. But when you think about it, do you see how the note that's a sixth above the bass, okay, 6th above the bass, G is an E. Do you see how that goes down a step? So it's like 6 goes to 5th above the bass, and the note that's a 4th above the bass, the C, that slides down a step, and it goes to a 3rd above the bass. Isn't 5, 3 the numbers that indicate a root position triad? We don't even have to write them. Okay? But I guess what I'm trying to say is when 1/6/4 goes to 5, the figured bass look, if I could just write that over here, the figured bass under the bass notes is this. That's what it is. And what it turns out to be in analysis is 164 going to root position 5. That's what it is. And these lines, I don't know if I talked about these lines with figured bass. They just mean whatever voice has the sixth above the bass, like in this case it's the alto voice, that very voice goes down a step to produce a fifth above the same bass. And then whatever note has the fourth above the bass, in this case it's the soprano, that very voice slides down a step to produce a third above the bass in the same voice. It's not like you mix them around and change them, you know, it's just, all you do is just move a little bit by step. And these voices don't have to move at all. It's really, that's what I consider smooth.
So if you did it right, would it almost push toward like a key change or make it feel like your 5 is really 1?
Well,
Since you have tension on the 1, it's resolving to a 5.
yeah, and then usually what the 5 will do is it will resolve to a root position of this.
Okay.
Root position 1. So, for instance, if let's see how do I have the voice. I need to be able to see the board from here while I sit at the piano. And if we're in C major, this is what the 164 sounds like. It's kind of loosey-goosey, unstable. It goes to something stronger, which is the 5, and then that likes to go to root position 1. And if you ever listen to classical music in particular, you hear this all the time. You hear that all the time. It's a very common 3-chord progression kind of thing. And we're just learning right now how to part rate the 164 as it goes to the root position 5. Okay. So, just to summarize quickly, all second inversion triads, even though we're only going to be dealing with 164, double the bass note. And there's no exceptions, that's on your yellow sheet. After you do that, take the notes that are doubled in the 164, whatever voices they are, just keep them static. Don't move them up or down. Then the remaining 2 voices will move down by step. So if I can put up one more example over here in a slightly different key to see if we can apply that information, let's go to the key of G major, just for a change of pace. And what's the bass note of a 164 going to be in G major? Does anybody? Yeah, it's a D. And we know that this goes to root position 5, and what's the bass note of a 5 in G? A D also, right? They're supposed to have the same bass notes, and they do. Okay. Let's go ahead and voice this chord first. Remember, this is a D, F sharp, A chord. Hold on a second. No, this is a GBD chord with D in the bass. Thank you. GBD. So, what am I supposed to double? The D, that's right, okay. Let's just, for the sake of argument, let me double the D in the soprano. That means I need a G and a B left. For good spacing, let's put the G here and the B here. Okay. All right, now that I've got this straightened out in my mind, this is the D, F sharp, A chord. I've got the bass note, one of the double pitches, it's already sliding over. What's the other one that I have to just move over and keep staying? The soprano, right? Keep the soprano D, because that's the double pitch. There you go. And now how do I get the F sharp and the A in those inner 2 voices? They should just have to move how? Down a step. That's right. Look at that. Everything I need. It's a really smooth process. Composers use it all the time. They really do. So, on your next homework assignment for Monday, you're going to have a part rate, like a 2 or 3 or 4 measure part rate example at the bottom. And I think I give you a 164 to part rate, and it goes to a 5. So just so you remember how to do that. Keep the double tone static because they're doubled in, the same note is doubled in both chords. Move the remaining 2 voices down.
It's still cool in minor, right?
Yeah, same thing that happens in minor. Same thing happens in minor, exact same thing. Good. Okay, good. Any questions about that before I go on? Okay, so what I'd like to talk to you next is I'd like to start introducing a few things that are notes that do not belong to harmonies or chords in music. They're called non-chord tones. And I'd like to just introduce you to, there's a whole slew of them, but I'd just like to introduce you to a couple of these types. Okay? And I'll make some space for that up here on the board, and I'll get to some examples in a second. But first we should probably define what a non-chord tone is. You know, so far in all of our musical examples that we've been analyzing, all of the notes that we come across or that we're encountering, they belong to the chord that we're analyzing. That's kind of neat, nifty, right? I wish life was all that way. Everything you need to analyze for the chord is just right there, and there's nothing else. There's nothing extraneous. But in most music, however, most music also contains notes that do not belong to the harmonies that we analyze too. Okay, so we get some chord tones, but we get mixed in with that, we get some pitches that don't belong to or fit into the harmonies that we're analyzing. But to understand all of music, we need to understand what these non-chord tones are and how composers use them. So first of all, the term, and I believe the author uses the term as he spells it as one word, a non-chord, and then tone, non-chord tone. What is a non-chord tone? Well, the definition is basically just what the name implies. Non-chord tones are notes that are not members of the prevailing chord. In other words, if I have a C, E, G chord in a measure, but then for some reason in that measure there's a D, the D doesn't belong or fit into the C, E, G chord. So I would say that the D is a non-chord tone. It means it's not part of the chord. It's not a chord tone. This goes back way too many years, and I don't know if Sesame Street still does this, but they always used to have these things like, which one of these is not like the other? I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's kind of the deal with music. It's like, okay, which tones belong to the chord, and which ones don't? Because there's going to be probably sometimes now a little bit of both. All right, another term for a non-chord tone is also, some books will call it a non-harmonic tone. It means the same thing. These two terms are synonymous, non-chord tone and non-harmonic tone. Our author of our text actually uses the top one, which I think I use more frequently too. I call it a non-chord tone. And the author will abbreviate non-chord tone in the reading with these letters, NCT. Obviously non-chord tone. So that's what NCT means from now on. Okay, now, non-chord tones, their main purpose for composers for using them is to embellish or ornament the actual chord tones, the notes that do belong in the chord. Okay? So non-chord tones are primarily decorative, and as decorative tones, they're not really as important to the harmony, of course, as the actual chord tones are. Just so you know, the chord tones are always the most important. The non-chord tones, they're just more like a little fluff. They're a little more decorative, ornamental, or embellishing. Now, non-chord tones there's a whole slew of them. And they're classified according to how they're approached and how they're left. In other words, if I've got a note here, and I've got another note here, and I've got another note here, let's say this is the non-chord tone. I'd like to know, how is this tone approached? Is it approached by a step? Is it approached by a skip? Or is it approached by the same note? How would you say this one's approached by? Step, skip, or same tone? It's approached by a skip, right? Yeah. And then how would you say this pitch is left by? Is it left by a step, a skip, or by the same tone? It's left by a step. Yeah. We can also observe how a non-chord tone, if this is the one in question, we can also observe that it's approached by a step up, and it's left by sorry, what did I say? It's approached by a skip up or a leap up. I don't remember what I just said, sorry. But it's left by a step down. So direction comes into play as well. We can observe that. I don't want to get too involved in these specific definitions just yet until I actually use one as a concrete example so you can see what I mean by that. Okay. Also, you need to know that when we analyze a chord, if we find a note that doesn't belong to that chord, we always put parentheses around the note that doesn't belong. Okay? That's how we're going to mark or identify a pitch that we know doesn't fit into the prevailing harmony. That's going to be our way to mark it. We're going to put parentheses around that note. A universal way to mark non-chord tones. And then after we do that, then we just notate, or not notate, but we just observe how is the non-chord tone approached. Is it approached by skip or step? Is it left by skip or step? Those kinds of things. And that'll help us give it a particular specific label. Okay? All right, so now it's time to start applying this to an actual example. Let me start by putting up, and I'll use C major as a key. I hope you can see this red okay. I feel that it's a little, at least a little darker than the black marker that's starting to lose all of its luster. And so let's try this. Okay. And I'm going to say that because the majority of the notes in this measure are C, E, and G, I'm going to analyze the whole measure as a one chord in C major. But you'll notice that there is one pitch in this measure that doesn't belong to a C, E, G chord. Which one is that? The D, right? All the notes in this measure are C, E, or G, which fit into and match up with C major tone. But one of these notes doesn't, and that's the D. So, how do I mark that in the music now? I put a set of parentheses around it. That tells me this one doesn't fit. This one doesn't belong. Okay? Now, the two types of non-chord tones I want you to be familiar with and learn today are, one is called a passing tone, and one is called a neighbor tone. And there are abbreviations for these. The passing tone is, of course, labeled or abbreviated PT, and the neighbor tone is abbreviated NT. Now, there is a table on page 186 that's very informative in terms of defining and specifying how these two types of non-chord tones are different. Now this TV wasn't working, it wasn't behaving very well in an earlier class. I'm going to try it one more time and see if it'll show you page 1. This is from page 186 in your book. Okay. Whoops, that's not the page I want. There we go. Yeah, there's this nice green. You guys, it's not easy being green. There's this nice green table on page 186 in your book, and I don't know if you can see that very well, but at the top of the table, it says there's a non-chord tone name and its abbreviation. And by the way, the book uses a different abbreviation than I do. That's, who cares, right? They do that. So there's the non-chord tone name, and this defines it. How is it approached by and how is it left by? So you see the first one in the top row, a passing tone? The definition of a passing tone, it's a note that first of all doesn't fit in the harmony, and that it's approached by a step, but it's left by a step in the same direction that it's approached by. That's the definition of a passing tone. It's a specific type of non-chord tone. All of these, first of all, they can't belong to the harmony, first and foremost. If they fit into the harmony, don't even bother with this. They fit into the harmony. But if they don't fit into the harmony, put a parentheses around it like that. And take a look. This is an example of a passing tone. You see how, and I just want you to look at the up stem notes here, because the D occurs in the soprano voice. So we're only looking at how it's approached in the soprano voice and how it's left in the same soprano voice. The alto voice, tenor voice, and bass voice have nothing to do with this non-chord tone. So how is this D approached? Well, look at the previous soprano note. It's approached by a step. Do you see how it's also left by a step in the same direction it was approached by? See, it's approached by a step down, it's left by a step down. Therefore, it must be a passing tone. And so it's just somewhere near the note. You can just put the abbreviation PT, and that's enough to label it. That's enough to explain what that note is doing there. You see, theorists in music, we like to be able to explain everything that we see. We need ways to explain and define the music that we find, the actual music, you know. And so far, we know how to explain all the notes in this measure except for this one. But now we do know how to explain it. It just happens to be a pitch that's not part of the chord, and we call it a passing tone. You see how this note kind of passes in between the E and the C? I think that's part of why it's called a passing tone. Passing tones, the most common context in which you'll find them. Passing tones generally occur between two chord tones that are a third apart. You see how this E, it's a chord tone? This C is a chord tone, and those are a third apart. Passing tones fit right in between perfectly. They do. And that's pretty common for passing tones. Now, I'm trying to give you a real simple example, something that's pretty obvious. It's not going to sound the greatest, but I mean, basically we have this. You like that? Okay, so a passing tone again, a non-chord tone that's approached by step, left by step in the same direction. Now, there's one other type of non-chord tone I want to teach you today, and that's the neighbor tone. And I'll try to put a real, hopefully, clear example up on the board here in this next measure. So C, E, C, G, and C, E, C, G, and... Okay. Once again, every note in this measure, C, E, G, belongs to a one chord. Except for which one? The D, right? The D doesn't belong. Okay. So since it doesn't belong to the harmony, I'll put parentheses around it. Notice how this one happens to be approached a lot. It's approached by a step, kind of like that one. But unlike that one, this one is left by a step in the opposite direction from which it's approached. So in other words, this one's approached by a step up, and it's left by a step in the opposite direction, a step down. And you can see in the second row of that chart there, it's called a neighbor tone. A neighbor tone is a non-chord tone approached by a step and left by a step in the opposite direction. So, whereas a passing tone fills in the small space or the small gap of a third, a neighbor tone actually embellishes or ornaments a single chord tone. Do you see how the same pitch, C, is on both sides of it? That's what it's there for. It's to ornament or embellish a single pitch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to label this with its abbreviation. It happens to be an NT, a neighbor tone, not a passing tone, because of how it's approached in the soprano and left in the soprano. Neighbor tones like this, they can be what's called, this is called an upper neighbor tone, because the note itself is slightly above the chord tone that it's embellishing. But neighbor tones can also be called lower neighbor tones. So for instance, I could have something like this too, couldn't I? That B doesn't fit in the C, D chord. But it's still a neighbor tone, right? Because it's approached by step and left by step in the opposite direction. So So, what would this sound like? Let me play the measure first with the D that I had, and then I'll play it with the B. So I've got like this. As a standard Hebrew tone. Or I could do it this way. It's just an extra, it's like additional color or pitch spice or whatever in the measure. It's not just the plain chord tones all the time. Okay, so let me see here. I think I'm almost there. What I want to do is I want to go back a page in your textbook to page 185, and I want to show you this. Let's see, how am I going to forget it? I want to show you this short example. Yeah. There we go. I want to show you this short example, and we'll take a look at it. This is a little, the first few measures of a song by Schubert. And what I have, the author has told us that this passage is in F major. And the author analyzed the first measure. And I went ahead and I analyzed the next measure, the next measure, and the next measure, just so we could have that all filled in. And then the following measures the author has analyzed. So you see, it's a 1, 1, 1, 1, 5, 7, 1. That's the real harmony. Now, do you see how in the, by the way, that top staff, treble staff there, that's called the voice part. The grand staff down below is the piano accompaniment. Now look in the voice part. Do you see how the author has located or identified 3 pitches that are not part of the prevailing harmony by putting parentheses around them? I know it's kind of small, but can you see those parentheses? Yeah. Okay. So you see how in measure 3 here, the harmony is FAC. Okay? Those are the only chord tones, FAC. So then, let me take this out. There we go. So then what intonation is this B flat doing in there? Yeah, kind of decorating it, making it a musical line, that kind of thing. Well, all the other pitches in measure 3, even in the voice part, are A and C. They fit into the F chord, but the B flat doesn't. So that's why the author put parentheses around it. Now, that it's identified or located for us, what type of non-chord tone is it? Is it a passing tone or a neighbor tone? It's a passing tone, yeah. And how do you know? Well, yeah, because it's approached by a step and it's left by a step in the same direction. Yeah, it's just like a straight line, exactly. Whether it goes up or down, it doesn't matter as long as it's there. So I label it with a PT, stands for passing tone.
Does it have to be, okay, does it have to be a step in the scale, or can, like, you added an accidental? Especially, like, for the neighborhood tone, for Vergang, is that if you had the same note, the same C, you just added like a sharp to it, would it still be?
It would still be a neighbor, yeah. You can have what's called chromatic passing tones and neighbor tones, or you can have diatonic ones.
All right.
In other words, the notes don't have to fit in the key exactly, let alone fit in the chord. If they don't fit in the chord, they can barely be anything that you know. Okay. All right, so let's take a look now at measure 5. The harmony in measure 5 is 5, 7, and F. And just so you know, remember, a 5, 7 in F major would be C, E, G, B flat. Any C, E, G, or B flat in measure 5 belongs to the chord. So what on earth is this A doing in here? The A is there just to, again, make a melodic line. Okay? It's not part of the chord. It's not meant to be part of the chord. So we analyze it by locating it. We put parentheses around it. We say, hey, that doesn't belong. Now, which of the 2 types of non-chord tones that we learned is it? Is it a passing tone or a neighbor tone? It's a passing tone, that's right, because it's approached by step, left by step in the same direction. So I'm going to label it then with a PT, not an NT. Whoops, I labeled the wrong one.
Vergang.
Let's see, do I have a eraser? Well, it's going to have to do. All right, finally, measure 6. The harmony is still C, E, G, B flat. Does that D in the soprano voice or the top voice, does that work? No, it doesn't fit at all. Okay? So, We put parentheses around it. What type of non-chord tone is it in this case? It's a neighbor tone. You see how it's approached by a step, but left by a step in the opposite direction that it was approached by. So we call it a neighbor tone, abbreviated N. By the way, neighbor tone is a really good, I think, name or label for this, because it's like the D is a neighbor to the real tone C. It's like the C is the chord tone, and it says, hey neighbor, the D is just right there. And then, that goes back to where it came from. That's a neighbor tone, right next to it. Okay, now I don't think I'll be able to show this at the same time that I play it. I really would like to, but I wanted to get this off of YouTube and see if it would play for you. So just give me a second here. What I sometimes tell my students, even though I don't have this, take a milk and cookie break. I don't have milk and cookies, but just take a milk and cookie break.
Do we have any pears?
I have grapefruit in my dorm.
Grapefruit?
We usually have apples, don't you?
Ooh, yeah, good.
Oh, no.
I have apple.
Yeah,
I have an apple there.
What? Yeah.
Hey, you never know, you might need to go hiking at college.
Just take a hike on the golf course.
But
I was
you
supposed to
have
eat dollars.
You actually went out and used that coupon, didn't you?
Cookie bun.
We went and got donuts, we went and got we got the newspapers, and we saw that there was a grapefruit.
Oh, no, because I got my grapefruit and stuff. No.
Not even gonna get the best deals.
Okay. I wish I could show you, if you have your book, you could open up to page 185 and follow along. But I'm gonna, just so that we can hear it. There you go. There was the passage there. That's the neighbor tone. It's not a very nice sound melody. Let's hear it one more time since it goes fast. There, from the beginning. That's a nice neighbor tone. Okay. Well, anyways, that kind of gives you a little. If those non-chord tones weren't there, the melody would probably sound a lot more plain, perhaps a little more boring, perhaps. Okay. All right, so as we get ready to go here for Monday, I've got a handout, and on the top of the handout, I want you to do harmonic or Roman numeral analysis. But now, with some of these chords, you might find a pitch that doesn't belong into the harmony. So put parentheses around it and label it as a PT or an NT. Okay? And then down below, I want you to do some part writing. I've given you the soprano. You're going to fill in the alto, tenor, and bass according to these Roman numerals. And two of the chords in the middle here is a 1, I don't have it in there, 1, 6, 4, 5, which we talked about. I think that's it.
Awesome sauce.
I mistook that, gotcha.
Did you
You
understand?
go 1, 6, 4 to 5. I was thinking like literally a 1, a 6, a 4
No,
to 5. I
it's
know you mean that though.
5, 6, yeah. Okay. Yeah, it should make sense when you look at the Roman numerals. Okay. Yes. And we will see you on Monday.
Have a nice weekend, Doc.
Yes, you too. It's probably supposed to be pretty, I mean, it might be windy, but temperature-wise, it's supposed to be pretty nice.
Yeah, I'm hoping we'll both finish Saturday.
No, thank you. I'm gonna get food.
I have tractors and then I have windows.
Yes.
I have to go eat food.
Your ETA.
Thank you.
What are you up to, Logan? Huh? What are you up to?
I'm going home.
Wow, that's really I guess you only get, I think you only get.
Like right now, I got a
Yeah,
new phone from my house.
that's really crazy.
It is. Hello. Hello.
That's
Not me, not you.